Have you ever, found yourself reading the Bible and then maybe thinking to yourself, here in the back of your head, like, what is really happening here? Then you find yourself forcing yourself to understand and bring your own ideas there because you have to fill so many holes in the story. And then it becomes more you than the Bible itself, right? Have you ever been there? And you feel like there should be a better way of doing this. Then you feel like this is not an honest way of reading the Bible. If you have, I get you, sis. I get you, brother, because that's me. And that is every modern 2022, as of this video, 2022 person reading a really ancient book. That is all of us. But there is a way of doing it better. Not perfect, but better. And this is why I'm here. Every time we read the Bible, we operate through a series of givens. A series of ideas, concepts, facts that you unconsciously assume that the ancient readers and writers of the Bible knew to be true or assumed to be true of reality of the world. Like, for example, that slavery is wrong, or that there's a thing called the laws of gravity, or that you should brush your teeth daily. We bring so much of our modernness into the Bible that you sometimes need a buddy like me, to remind you of how different the Old Testament and New Testament world was from ours. And my plan is to do this by giving you a series of really interesting and fun facts, things that the ancients had no idea about that we just, take for granted and act on those as a given. Did you know that they had absolutely no idea that dinosaurs existed? Did you know that not even George Washington knew in his lifetime that dinosaurs existed? That's how new our idea of dinosaurs is. And if they had no idea of dinosaurs, of course they had no idea that the Earth is millions and millions of years old. And if they had no idea of how old the Earth is, they had no idea of the scope and magnitude of who Yahweh really was. Isn't that an interesting thought? When the psalmist says that the heavens declare the glory of God and the skies proclaim the work of his hand, he literally had no idea of the scope and magnitude of what he was saying. Ain't that something? So in this sense, New Testament and Old Testament folk had really no idea who they were worshiping, who they actually serve. At least not at the level we do. Not that we are better, it's just, you know what I'm saying. When the ancients thought about gods, they didn't think about millions of galaxies and billions of stars. They didn't think in those quantitative numbers or qualities. They thought about stories. Their ideas of the gods were always based on stories, on battle, on hierarchies, not in how big the universe and the ever-expanding universe is. You and I might tend to go, oh, how great is our God, and we're thinking, besides of his sacrifice and how much he forgave me, it's how big, he holds the universe of huge and big and millions and billions and stars. How great is our God? They were not praising that way. Paul was not praising that way. David was not praising that way. Of course, like Abraham or Moses, they were not thinking of their God in those terms. Their imagination wasn't there when they were thinking about God. And talking about the idea of numbers and millions and billions of stars, they didn't count or have numbers in the way that we do. Have you ever thought about that? The numbers 1, 2, 350, 5,021. That kind of system was developed in the 6th and 7th century and introduced into Europe in the 12th century. And I'm not saying that they couldn't tell, oh, how many coins do I have? I don't know, we're so dumb. Of course they had their own systems of measuring, money and length, distance between Jerusalem to Rome or Samaria. And I don't know, because I'm absolutely ignorant in this regard, but I don't think they could count, millions, or though that concept wouldn't be in their heads of millions and billions. I might be absolutely wrong, and they might have had some sort of system. So if you know something about it, please leave me a message in the comment with the link or with your beautiful scientific and smart explanation as to how they would have, conceived millions of grains of rice or salt, like how they would have counted. I don't know. If you can help me with that, much love to you. And on a completely separate topic, when most of us read the Bible, our approach is mostly in a devotional way, right? Like, oh God, I wanna, get to know you more, hear your voice and what you have to say to me. Is a very devotional and almost romantic way of approaching the scriptures, right? But that's kind of foreign for the Old Testament and New Testament people. Reading in their beds, today, my beloved son, daughter, wife, we're gonna read Psalm, and then we're gonna jump to Revelations, and then we're gonna go back to Genesis 2. None of Christ's followers or Old Testament people would have done that. Because to start, less than 20% of the average Roman citizen could read, was literate. And this number dramatically drops to less than 10% if you're talking about people who lived in Judea, Galilee, and places like that. And to add to that, most of the writings of the Old Testament and New Testament were done on parchment or papyruses. Papyruses? papyruses, on parchments or papyruses. Papyruses? On papyrus. Parchment or parchment or papyrus. So the odds of a regular Joe, regular Jew knowing how to read and owning its own, parchment or papyrus of the Psalms or Isaiah or Micah were really low. People would go to the synagogue, the temple, to hear the scriptures being read. Paul had his trusted friends, his trusted disciples. He would give the letter to that trusted friend, and that trusted friend would travel to church in Thessalonica or the church in Ephesus, and he would stand up, scroll away and just read what Paul said out loud. The whole, community, the small community would just like sit, families, and hear what Paul was saying. So in most of the cases, the scriptures were only heard, not read. And I'm gonna assume that your beautiful and intelligent mind already gets the idea that I'm not Scandinavian or that I'm not German. Why? Because of my chocolate skin, soft chocolate skin, my accent, just my vibe. I'm from the Americas, not America, but the Americas, right? South America. And I might need to point this out to you. You know that Moses, Abraham, David, none of the disciples, none of the early disciples, none of the subsequent disciples thought of me, thought of my ancestors, thought of the Americas. They had no idea the Americas existed. They had zero intentions of taking the gospel to the Americas, a place that didn't exist in their mind. So the idea of, preaching the gospel to the ends of the earth and making disciples to every nation, we were not included. Nobody was thinking of us. Nobody. You believe that? They didn't have me in their imagination. For the Americas, that one is a doozy, because I'm half Spanish and half indigenous. So maybe they thought of my Spanish half. I don't know how you feel about that, but I'm gonna leave it there. This is another interesting one. Have you ever realized that they had no idea of the existence of the microbial life, of viruses and bacteria? They didn't know they were this little satanic mini bugs that would try to kill you every day and eat you up, but that at the same time made you stronger. But sometimes you weren't strong enough, so they would kill you. They had no idea our bodies were fighting these little demonic bugs on a daily basis, nonstop. They didn't know this were the things that would cause illnesses. So anytime they would see Jesus heal, they weren't thinking, oh, God is attacking bacteria, God is attacking viruses, he's triumphing over rebel cells. I don't want to put my ideas into their heads because I don't know what they were thinking, but it was mostly spiritual warfare, a battle between the powers. And here I'm going to drop one more thought in your head that might blow your mind. Do you know that this action, they had no idea that oxygen would come in and somewhere along the way it would chemically transform into CO2, and do you also realize that they never had to go through the stupid hassle of having to memorize the periodic table of elements? Did you know that? That they never had to do the dumbest of the dumbest exercises, which is memorizing the periodic table of elements, so nobody knew about
antimony, arsenic, aluminum, selenium, and hydrogen, and oxygen, and nitrogen, and rhenium, and nickel, neodymium, neptunium, germanium. Everybody! And iron, americium, ruthenium, uranium.
And then let's talk about our Old Testament folks. They didn't think about Yahweh or Elohim in monotheistic terms. For most of the Old Testament history, Yahweh, Elohim, it was one of the gods in a plethora of gods. Elohim, Yahweh, was their God, their king. In their heads, the most powerful, because he proved himself. Like for example, with the Egyptians, he proved himself to be the most powerful, but not the only one. In their heads, Yahweh wasn't the only God that existed. And that idea of existing, it's loaded with modern concepts. The idea of monotheism, that there was only one God and the God was Yahweh, that idea started to grow and develop and mature just like 200-300 years before Jesus. So Moses didn't think like that, Elijah didn't think like that, Abraham didn't think. Yahweh was one God amongst the many. And while we're in the topic of our Old Testament folks, it's really interesting to think that Moses, the Moses, never handed Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. He didn't hand Torah fully finished to Joshua. He's like, Joshua, you're the new leader. Boom, I'm done. Before I die, I finished the last word of Torah. There you go. boom, the 5 books. Did you know that never happened? Did you know that the books of the Torah and the books of the Hebrew scripture as we know them today, or close to what we know them today, they were collected and finished after the return from the Babylonic exile? The exiles that came back from Babylon needed to know who they were as a nation, what was important for them as a nation, their history as a nation. So there is where the sources were collected and the books were put together, not before. So that means that Joshua didn't have Torah, that David didn't have the Torah as we have it today, neither Solomon nor Samuel. We tend to think that any sane, good, nice Christian have basically the same theology as the first disciples of Jesus. But that is not true. There are very key and important and fundamental theological developments that happened hundreds of years after the death of the disciples that we take for granted that they didn't have. For example, the theology of the Trinity that happened hundreds of years later with, for example, the idea of substance, that Jesus is of the same substance as the Father. That idea, the Greek idea of word substance, wasn't in their heads when they were thinking about Jesus and Jesus is the Son of God. Or the idea of original sin, that every person was born with this original sin caused by Adam and Eve. Adam, basically. That idea was developed 400 years later with Augustine. Or the idea of transubstantiation and that whole fight of what happens in communion. They were thinking about that when they were having communion back then. You know, what happens with the bread and the wine? You know, and as we said before, they weren't thinking of monotheism or for example, purgatory. All those were later developments that we take for granted that they didn't have in their heads necessarily. You know, seeing and reading the Bible through different angles is super exciting. So having these things in your head when you approach the Bible, you're gonna open things you've never seen before. This video is gonna help you in your journey towards understanding the Bible even better or making it even more exciting. See you there.